Breaking news, fellas. You know me, I don't do breaking news, right? But this is one of them. Donald Trump wants to resettle Afrikaners to the United States of America. Basically, he wants to make space for white South Africans, accusing the government of racial discrimination. Fellas, we are in South Africa. No presentation today. Thank you very much. I appreciate you. Now, Donald Trump wants to resettle white South Africans facing racial-based discrimination. This was done after he signed an executive order vowing to stop aid and assistance to South Africa. So it's done. They've signed an order to sanction South Africa. Why does he want to sanction South Africa? Because he accuses the current government of racial bias when it comes to land resettlement. So the South African government came up with a brand new law where they needed to take some land from the white South Africans and give it back to the government in order to build the things that are profitable for everybody. For most of you who don't know, reports say that the majority of land in South Africa, arable land, is owned by white South Africans, even though white South Africans are the minority, less than 10% in South Africa. So the government came up with a brand new law that was being put in place in order to be fair. In other words, if there is land and this land has not been utilized or the land has not been developed, let's just say a land that's been sitting there for nothing, government can take that land and use it for a communal reason. So it could be something for public interest, could be maybe an hospital, could be a factory that's profit the entire country. And for them, they think it makes no sense that somebody owns a big chunk of land since 1913 and do absolutely nothing with it. So with that, Donald Trump said this.
What's happening in South Africa, the leadership is doing some terrible things, horrible things. So that's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. And until such time as we find out what South Africa is doing, they're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
It's a hot day in South Africa, and Donald Trump has just come on air to say that he has seen the terrible things going on in South Africa. I live here, and I haven't really seen the terrible things he speaks about. I'm continually amazed at the disinformation that this man sends. I'm amazed that anyone would believe him. We in South Africa are laughing. We honestly are. But what worries me most is that you Americans seem to believe him. Even statements about your own country, you believe that he's doing the best thing. I feel very sad for you and very down. I hope you can get this man out one way or the other. Goodbye.
So initially he stopped the aid, saying they're doing an investigation to be sure that South Africa is truly persecuting white people by taking the lands that belongs to them. After that, South African president came up and said, we are not taking any land from nobody. We have not taken land on Twitter. And Elon Musk retweeted by saying, but why do you have openly racist laws? So within that time frame, they tried to find diplomatic reason. And the United States of America clearly continued doing investigation. Let's also note that Cyril Ramaphosa at some point said, we are not intimidated. We're not pushovers. We are not afraid. And that, as you would imagine, perhaps is something that somebody of a caliber of Donald Trump will not appreciate very much.
We will not be deterred. We are, as South Africans, a resilient people, and we will not be bullied.
Well, now they've come up with the conclusion, okay? Now, no more aid for South Africa. No more financing any program to South Africa. And this includes PEPFAR. What is PEPFAR?
I came to fetch my medication here.
This is just one of the sexual health clinics that have been shut down since the US aid funding freeze. This one in the heart of Johannesburg has been catering for women with sexually transmitted diseases like HIV, now completely closed. We've seen people try and enter and be turned away. But given South Africa's history with HIV, with the catastrophe that happened in the early 2000s around the epidemic, this is scaring people in this community who think they might not get access to treatment. Are you trying to go to the clinic?
Yeah.
It's closed.
What happened?
The US aid funding has been frozen, so they're closing down clinics. Do you have alternatives?
I don't know. I'm going to ask next door. Hopefully they'll be able to assist me. If they can't, I don't know. I don't know what to do. Serious. What will I do? There's nothing.
So PEPFAR is one of those programs that was initiated by George Bush in 2003. The goal was to provide antiretroviral medication to fight against HIV and tuberculosis and many other stuff like that.
I asked the Congress to commit $15 billion over the next 5 years, including nearly $10 billion in new money, to turn the tide against AIDS in the most afflicted nations of Africa and the Caribbean.
Let me just remind you here, South Africa is one of the countries with the highest level of HIV. Some report claiming up to 8 million people affected with HIV. And clearly, PEPFAR is something that has helped many people to remain in good health and continue living up until now. Now, PEPFAR is aid coming from the United States of America to many African countries, and South Africa being one of the biggest beneficiaries of this program. Why? Because of a disagreement that they had absolutely nothing to do with. As you can clearly see, many of the people that are affected with HIV are not going to benefit from this anymore because of a law that's been voted by not them, but by politicians. Does America have the right to stop their aid? Yes, they do have the right. Why? Because it belongs to them. Now, should have South Africa thought forward on something like this to prevent it from ever happening? Absolutely. South Africa has a program that helps people with HIV. And according to Cyril Ramaphosa, only 17% of that program is financed by the United States of America. But the US aid is not limited to medical. There is economical. There are many other things. Now let's get back to the resettlement of white South Africa to the United States of America. Trump wants to resettle white South African race-based discrimination. The order also said that the United States of America will establish a plan to resettle Afrikaners, white South African, generally of Dutch descent, and their families as refugees escaping government-sponsored race-based discrimination. It comes after Trump signed an executive order suspending the United States Refugee Admission Program for 90 days. Now, the United States Admission Program is a program that accepts refugees from all over the world. Donald Trump stopped it. But in spite of the fact that he has stopped that, he is indeed ready to resettle white South Africans to America. So other refugees from all over the world, no, they can stay home. White South Africans, Afrikaners, can come to the United States of America. He signed an executive order vowing to stop aid and assistance to South Africa over human rights violation, including a Land Reform Act in which it said discriminated against white South Africans. Does this remind you of something? Does this remind you of something? I think this reminds me of Zimbabwe. What happened to Zimbabwe? Well, Robert Mugabe came into power and he wanted to take the land back from white settlers. Who were these settlers? They were British descent, living in Zimbabwe for years. After colonization, they stayed and ran most of the land in Zimbabwe. They were farmers, they were producers. Now, Robert Mugabe said he wanted to split the land, give some of the land to the black people. He took the land from white people and gave it to black people. Well, many of the whites left the country. Some of them crossed to South Africa to continue their life.
Getting land from them, and that's all. They're not being hounded out of the country. Not at all.
They're being hounded off their land.
Not of their land.
It's not theirs.
Our land.
Even though they bought it, with the certificates of approval from the government?
But haven't you heard of the Lancaster House discussions and the agreement with the British government? Because they are British settlers. Originally they have been British settlers. And we agreed at Lancaster House that there would be land reform.
Very shortly after what happened, they were hit with sanctions. Sanctions from America, sanctions from Britain, from Europe, and many other places. And Zimbabwe, as you would remember, could not trade internationally. So they were economically sanctioned and the country went to the gutter. Yes, there's also a level of responsibility by the Zimbabwean that took over the land and did not know how to manage that land. But in spite of the fact they had no experience on how to trade, on how to be efficient farmers due to lack of experience, there was also the sanctions that were weighing over the shoulders of this country. The West justified this by saying they were sanctioning Mugabe. But in reality, the people that really suffered in Zimbabwe were the Zimbabweans. So at the end of the day, what happened? Most of the Zimbabweans left the Zimbabwe and crossed into South Africa, following the white farmers they had chased a few years before. Fellas, up until now, Zimbabwe is still sanctioned, even though Robert Mugabe is dead long time ago. They said they were sanctioning Mugabe. However, the sanctions are still on. Are we seeing something very similar happening to South Africa right now? Why is Donald Trump after South Africa? Are white Afrikaners really persecuted in South Africa? Question mark. Is it fair to take some of the land and attribute them to the black people? Question mark. If you take the land from somebody that historically perhaps his grandfather took the land without necessarily having to purchase it, do you have to pay them? Question mark. Or do you maybe have to pay them because they developed the land? Question mark. Or should you not pay them maybe because they took the land by force, whether it was them or their grandfather? Question mark. Now, is Donald Trump just trying to be fair by saying from now on, because you are being a discriminative, a racialist government, we are going to support the people that are being discriminated against? Or do you think he's only doing that because the people that are in this case perceived as discriminated are white people? Question mark. Would have Trump done the same if the people that were discriminated against were not white? Question mark. I mean, well, look at what's happening in Australia. The Aborigines have been claiming lands that were traditional to them, spiritual to them, that are being utilized right now for the purpose of big industries. Who is speaking for them? Question mark. Now, does that justify the fact that you will take land by force from Afrikaners who've worked very hard to develop farm and many other things? Well, it looks like the government is not trying to do that. It looks like, and I'm saying it looks like, I'm not giving my opinion. Be smart. It looks like the government wants to only take the land that are not being used by anybody, but belongs to somebody since 1913. Now, there's another video of another person who's probably going to answer a question. He's a white South African, and listen to him.
Hey, lovely people, and particularly a quick word to my American friends who might be tempted to believe what Donald Trump is saying about South Africa, my home country, where I happen to be right now. Him and Elon Musk are racist twats, because what they're doing is taking the word of a fringe racist group called Afriforum and other disaffected whites, disgruntled by the end of apartheid, feeling hard done by, and much like the Israelis, victimizing themselves when they are not victims at all, bitching about how land redistribution is racist against whites. These are such ignorant provocateurs, and it's going to backfire on them. South Africans' majority, the black majority, and it's a multiracial, multi-tribal society now, only own a tiny proportion of the land versus the size of their population. And while white South Africans make up 7% of the population, more or less, they own about 70% of the decent land. And so the redistribution of land is to address past inequities, and the vast majority of South Africans agree and understand why that's happening and that it's a good thing. It's also under a very strict mechanism. Now, not everyone agrees, of course, with the mechanism, but the principle is what racists like Musk and Trump are railing against here on behalf of a bunch of assholes who equate equality with oppression, because for so many years, decades and decades of the apartheid era, they were the oppressor. And as we know, whenever the oppressor looks at something like equality, it suddenly becomes oppression of him. Idiots from Afriforum, you probably know nothing about them, but this is a bunch of, the equivalent of your kind of Proud Boys hanging on to some past that never actually existed, and a past in which the vast majority of people in this country were oppressed, suppressed, and treated much like, fortunately not quite as badly as the Israelis treat the Palestinians. So this whole railing against South Africa, I'm going to add one more point. South Africans on the whole, all of us, white, black, Indian, colored, which is not a term, is a specific term for those of you who might get offended by that, a specific racial group. We are very, very resilient people. As a country, we have gone through a great deal, both in terms of the early part and then the transition from the apartheid era to genuine multicultural democracy. And whatever Trump throws at us, we can handle. We can handle it because we've been through far, far worse in our history. And my hope is that South Africans all turn around with one voice and tell Trump to fuck off with his sanctions and his fucking withdrawal of aid and his tariffs and all of this stuff, because we can live through it. What I'm not sure about is whether Americans can, because for the most part, all the stuff that Vivek Ramaswamy said recently about Americans being soft, not prepared to put in the hard graft, and all this stuff, I tell you, for the experience of most foreigners is true. And it's not true of every American I know. Some of them are the most hard-working, wonderful people in the world. But as a general principle, South Africans are far more resilient and able to withstand this kind of authoritarian pressure than any American population. So, to my fellow South Africans, let's stick this out. Let's stick up the middle finger to Trump and particularly to Elon Musk, because we know from his background that he left South Africa in the apartheid era and retains the racist that's motivating these people like Creel. And now that I'm in South Africa, I'm seeing their awesome, ridiculous tweets. Those guys as well. They're the past. Most of us are the future, and it's a beautiful future.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with his style of expression, which can come to some people hurtful. What's interesting here, I think it's necessary that we hear what he has to say, suppressing his choice of words, which is not to the taste of everybody. Now, is he telling lies just because he's saying things in a way that is not necessarily the way you would like to hear it? Question mark. Now, is he telling the truth? I don't know. Question mark. Let me know how you feel about this. It was a great pleasure. Now, before we finish this, do you think this has nothing to do with white South Africans, but it has everything to do with the fact that South Africa took Israel to court? And you know, Trump is a very good friend of the Israelis. And also South Africa showed a lot of support to Russia and BRICS and the development of an alternative currency to use for international trade instead of the dollar. Let me know how you feel about this. It's always a great pleasure. God bless.